We on. Ayuki, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of the Indigenous Virtual Speaker Series. It's me, your host, Charlie Reed. I'm very excited today. We have a very inspiring speaker, and I'm joined here with Dr. Virgil Moorhead Jr. So I hope everyone's enjoying their lunch right about now. It's a beautiful day here in Humboldt County. So here's Virgil Moorhead Jr.
Hello, everybody. So I'm excited really to introduce our speaker today. You know, I've been following his work for many years, and he's a great, inspiration. You know, a little bit about his bio is he's a professor in the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State and the co-founder of the Teaching Excellence Network. And as a classroom teacher in East Oakland over the past 23 years, around then, his pedagogy has been widely studied and acclaimed for producing uncommon levels of social and academic success for students. You know, I was in preparation for this talk, I was listening to this scholar, Howard Fuller, and one of the things that he was saying was, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. He talked about those people who want the crop without plowing up the ground. They want the rain without the thunder and lightning. And what I really respect about Jeff and Dr. Andrade Duncan is he's been on the ground battling for those that are most marginalized in our communities, that he is an ally to indigenous communities. He's a social justice advocate and really walks the walk as I see it. And so welcome, Dr. Duncan-Andrade.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
And so we're going to get right started. We have an hour, so we're going to get right to work and, having a conversation. I'll be asking some questions. Charlie will be asking some questions, but hopefully we could just pick your brain and be useful to all the people that are live with us right now on Facebook. And so one of the things you said to me in our email exchanges was that you would be interested in discussing the intersections of ethnic studies, wellness, and education, and its implication for indigenous communities and alignment with other non-dominant cultural communities. And so with that sort of framing, what was your thinking around, the importance of that?
Well, I think we're in another time of crisis. I mean, our communities have been in crisis since colonialism showed up. But suddenly, the broader, set of communities that we find ourselves in contact with are also using the word crisis. And, my biggest wondering is, will we use this as an opportunity to fundamentally rethink the purpose of public education in this, so-called democratic, pluralistic, multiracial society or not? And, this is an opportunity to look to indigenous peoples, to look to African peoples, to look to Rasa peoples, and really begin to explore what is it that has allowed us to be so incredibly resilient and hopeful in the face of persistent inequity, persistent crisis. And, sadly, I don't see much of that happening. I mean, I listened to I'm in California, and I listened to the state secretary of education or head of the Department of Education, Linda Darling Hammond, who, is situated at Stanford today. And she was talking about how proud she is of educators and how proud she is that, educators have stepped up and created these virtual learning communities and distance learning and et cetera. And, on one hand, like I am too, like I think teachers, I'm a parent of 2 7-year-olds, and, like the way teachers have stepped up is around the state is profound. And there's a lot of conversation about, the workers that have the frontline workers, whether it's medical workers or delivery folks, or who have been sort of thrust into this incredibly vulnerable position. And there's all this discussion about how much we respect them and how much we honor them and are grateful for them. And I think that's right. But there hasn't been a lot of conversation, or perhaps enough conversation, about how teachers have had to step up. And on the one hand, this is my 29th year in Oakland and as a teacher. And so I am honored to be part of a group of folks who have committed their lives to the young people in our community. At the same time, I'm troubled by the fact that what a lot of that work has represented is a reinvestment in whiteness and a reinvestment in the very same sensibilities about learning and what it means for young people to show progress that we've seen historically, and that have led us into this crisis. And not that schools are responsible for a global pandemic. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that when you face crisis, when our communities have faced crisis historically, we've used it as an opportunity to rethink how we're going to move forward, rethink what is our responsibility to our most vulnerable, rethink what is our responsibility to our children and our elders. And I haven't seen that in the educational discourse. What I've seen is, how do we continue and maintain business as usual? How do we take what we've always done with children and then move that online? And that, frankly, that makes me sad, because this is an opportunity for us to really question, what have we been doing? Right? And why do we think that is the path forward for justice? Why do we think that's the path forward for democracy? Why do we think that that's the path forward for these highfalutin principles that we've laid out rhetorically and yet never met in reality as a nation state? And so, as I watch my own community, I'm from Deep East Oakland, and as I watch my own community, even my own insular community, like inside of my family, as I watch, other communities around the nation and around the world, frankly, like I'm going to be on a call later today with the Maori community in New Zealand, the indigenous people of New Zealand, having a similar conversation about what's going on in New Zealand. New Zealand's being lauded for their response to COVID-19. And the Maori community is like, well, from an indigenous perspective, it's more complicated than that. So I think that this either, like crises generally present an opportunity for any community to revisit its fundamental purpose and principles, or not. And what concerns me is that I see too much of the or not in the conversations about how we're going to create meaningful educational opportunities for our nation's indigenous communities and our nation's most vulnerable communities, given the crisis that we're in.
Thank you. And so this is what I took from what you said, is this is an excellent opportunity to look at our educational system in this crisis, in this time of crisis, and go back to some of our roots, and let's say specifically as indigenous people. So my question is, you mentioned the Maori, and I'm wondering a little bit about maybe what has worked over there, because I've watched one of your videos and you talked about that one of the best examples of what education should look like is over there with what they did when they were on the brink of extinction, right? And that they were able and have been able to really to revitalize a lot of their ways through their educational system. So my question is can you unpack, or my request is unpack a little bit about what you think has worked over there?
Well, yeah, I think the Maori are an excellent example of um, of what's possible inside of a colonial context. You know, they're in a British schooling system, and they're an excellent example of what's possible in a colonial context that we, you know, frankly haven't learned much from. So, and true to your statement, there's, you know, I've had the tremendous privilege and opportunity to be in schools all over the world, and I've never seen a community that has more effectively grabbed hold of the reins in the education of their children in a way that is culturally and community responsive than I've seen when I've been in Maori communities in New Zealand. So, you know, you can, I think it's look, Malcolm X said once that of all the forms of study, the one that's most likely to reward your efforts is the study of history, because the truth is always lying there. And I think if you study the history of the Maori, you know, educational movement and self-determining educational movement, there's a lot to be learned there from us. And because it's a colonial context. And you know, the Maori, and I could get the years wrong, but I believe it was in the late 60s, early 70s, you know, by all measures, they were about a half a generation away from total language loss. And we know that when you lose your indigenous language, the rest just kind of like falls, the dominoes, right, topple. And there was a group of Maori elders led by, you know, arguably led by one of the most well-known Maori activists, whose name is Tamaiti, who said, kind of step back, right, and stopped externalizing the critique and the blame, and looked internally and said, what are we doing that's not working? Because we've been spending a tremendous amount of commitment and resources to try to maintain, sustain, and revitalize our language and our cultural practices, but it's not sticking. And so one of their sort of key findings from all of this was that they were making these tremendous investments in adults, right? So their cultural project was largely focused on adults reclaiming their language, adults reclaiming their cultural identity. And of course, the lag time on that is significant. So it takes years and years and years for us as adults to sort of re-find ourselves, right? Well, all the while, we're both raising our children in a hybrid or a disrupted cultural, right, framework and space, and we're sending our children to these white-centric schools. So there's this, there's this investment in adults, but the curve doesn't work like that for children. So the children's curve looks, more like this, right? And then you got to catch the children up because they've spent 13 years in white schools. And so it's a perpetual cycle of catch up. And so the Maori conclusion was that if we don't reclaim the education of our children, we're done for, right? We're constantly playing catch up. So they started Maori schools, and the first effort was this sort of guerrilla, like we're gonna take our kids to the woods, and we're gonna isolate them. We're gonna be autonomous, and this was treated as a threat to national security. And so literally the Maori government raided these schools, and not unlike what you saw happen in Arizona with the Mexican American Studies program, right? And where so I don't want to act like this is just some like international phenomenon. We did this in the United States. The state of Arizona passed legislation saying that ethnic studies, particularly the ethnic studies of Rasa children, was seditious, right? It was an act of sedition, and they terminated the ethnic studies program in Tucson Unified. So what happened in New Zealand is not dissimilar. That they sent in, you know, a team of you know, militarized operatives to end the indigenous schooling of these children, and the elders that were kind of driving this were incarcerated, right? They did a dying bid in federal prison in New Zealand for an act of sedition. So just think about that, like to educate our children in their own indigenous language, in their own indigenous cultural ways of knowing and learning, in their own indigenous history, is deemed an act of sedition. So that's very revealing about what it means for us to actually be self-determining in the education of our children. So, but nevertheless, what happened as a result was that a movement was started and a belief was started that we could do this, right? That we could do this in a colonial context. So a number of all across the New Zealand community, a number of Maori schools, indigenous Maori schools, whose primary focus is instruction in Maori language and instruction in Maori cultural practices and instruction in Maori cultural history, popped up. And so now, you know, you can go all over the country and see the impact of the sacrifice that a group of Maori elders made to save their community and to save their land. Well, I haven't seen that, and part of it is also size. You know, like New Zealand's small, and so you know you light a fire in a small fireplace, right? It covers the walls more quickly. I think that we've had a bigger struggle in the U.S. to connect the different indigenous struggles. And when I say indigenous struggles, I don't just mean the struggles of like Western indigenous people who are indigenous to the land that we're on. I mean all the indigeneity, right? The African indigeneity and the Asiatic indigeneity. I don't think we've done a good job of connecting those struggles in a way to talk about what it means for us to be both self-determining in our particular context, but also co-elaborative, which is different to me than collaborative, right? But to co-elaborate. And I feel like that's the gift that the Maori gave to me, is that my time in their community allowed me to elaborate, right? To co-elaborate on what their learning and what their experience means for me as a community member in East Oakland.
Thank you. And part of, you know, one of the things that I am taking from you and but also what you were saying with, you know, and maybe this is shows through data evidence, the benefits of ethnic studies or the benefits of community responsive, culturally responsive education is relationships and cultural identity. And so for those of you, those teachers that are maybe listening, or those administrators that are saying, well, you know, we need culturally responsive, community responsive education, that the benefits of cultural identity and relationships lead to good skills in reading, math, writing. Did I get that from you correctly? And if so, could you elaborate on a little bit of the importance of, you know, relationships and cultural identity?
Yeah, I think the argument that we've been making, that, and the irony here is that I am in schools all over the country all the time that claim to be data driven and research based, and they're not, or they are data driven, but you know, as I've often said, that they're driven by the wrong data. And so when you're driven by the wrong data, you keep ending up in the same wrong place. And then if you keep looking at the same wrong data, then you stay down that rabbit hole. But if you end up if you're data driven and you end up in a wrong place, then perhaps the question is are we looking at the right data? And And if you change the data you look at, it changes the questions you ask. And if you change the questions you ask, it changes the solutions you come up with. And I don't see enough of that happening. And largely the data that's driving the conversation is not research-based. You know, I challenge anybody who claims to be data-driven to show me the research that validates that we should be driving educational policy and practice based on state or national standardized test scores. Because I haven't seen that study. Because it doesn't exist. Because all of the studies coming out of psychometricians, coming out of psychologists, coming out of social epidemiology, coming out of public health, coming out of neuroscience are crystal clear on the fact that there is a set of leading indicators and there's a set of lagging indicators when we're talking about the development of children. And the leading indicators include things like the things that you just said, which is cultural identity and relationships. Those things aren't soft measures. They actually are determinant, and which makes them leading indicators. The lag indicators are the things you also mentioned: reading, writing, math, performance on the mechanics of learning. What we know with absolute certainty in all of those other fields that I just named, psychology, public health, social epidemiology, neuroscience, the medical field, child development, all of them, there's no debate in those fields that if you have a child that doesn't have a strong sense of their own identity, if you have a child that doesn't have strong attached relationships, then the idea that you're going to create consistent growth in reading, writing, and math is absurd. Now, the real issue that I have here is that if this absurdity were applied across communities, then I'd say, okay, we're just stupid, but we're not. And it's not. That if you look at any middle-class wealthy community that has experienced a school shooting, and you look at their response, okay, their response has been to shut down all of the academic discourse, all of the rhetoric around test scores, college going, link learning, that shit is shut down completely. And it's a recentering around wellness. Like, are you well? Is your heart well? Is your chest well? Is your body well? Is your identity well? Do you understand your sacredness? All the teachings of our ancestors are recentered for white people and middle class and wealthy people. And because they know absolutely that that's the most important thing for their children. And who gives a fuck, frankly, if your kid is Harvard bound and they hate themselves? So they know what matters most. But you see, when you live in a society where those things are already centered and valued and hyper invested in for your kids, you don't have to count on schools for that. You just count on schools for A, B, C, and 1, 2, 3. But we come from communities where our identity, our language, our historical origins, all of it is constantly under threat. We come from communities where we're literally hated for who we are. And then we show up to schools who ignore that fact. And in the process of ignoring that fact, they ignore all of the research. In the process of ignoring all the research, they also glob on to bad data. And then they use that data to explain to us why we're not doing a good job of educating our own children. It's circular colonial logic that has hundreds and hundreds of years of origin. And what brings it to the surface for me is the double-tonguedness, the duplicitousness of it. That when those same conditions land on their children, they suddenly change course. They suddenly change what values most to them. But when we show up every single day with this as our social norm, and we talk about these things as the leading indicators, somehow we're not rigorous. Somehow we're not actually committed to equity and equality and justice in educational pathways. And that's my issue, is that you don't get to talk out of both sides of your mouth. If when the plague lands in your community, you change the purpose and process for how you educate your children, then that's the right move. So why is it that you can't see the plague that is sitting inside of our communities that you have given us via your schooling blankets? And at what point do you actually acknowledge that this is not some part of our historical, racist, white supremacist past, but this is the maintenance of that very system, and that schools have operated as a core project of maintaining us in these subordinated cultural, linguistic identity positions in this society, which by definition means that we're not a pluralistic multiracial democracy, that we're a social apartheid, which is fine. Like, just fucking name it. Just say it. That's what we are. Stop telling me we're a pluralistic multiracial democracy while operating as if the lives of the children where I come from and the lives of the children in my community matter less than the lives of the children from wealthy and privileged communities.
Oh, that's some fire. Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlie. He had some questions that maybe he's come up for him or he's prepared.
Yeah, that was really inspiring. It got my heart rate going up pretty tremendously. So I'm just wondering, how can we co-elaborate that indigeneity with, education and our culture and our already existing ways of knowing, to have a grand goal of, giving back to our tribal youth, our underserved communities that we all care about?
Yeah, bro. I don't know. I mean, at one level, seeing what the Maori have done makes me believe that it's possible, and if you seeing is believing, so I know it's possible. We've been trying in our community, for some time, and I think what I'm confident about is that individual teachers and small collectives of folks can create spaces in schools, programs, individual classrooms where they can do the good work. And I'm 100% certain that that's happening in schools all over the nation. I've seen it. I've borne witness to it, and I've been a participant in it. So I know that's possible. I think what I'm seeking is what that actually looks like at the institutional level. What does it look like to do that, tip to finish, edge to edge, top to bottom, across an entire educational institution? And to be honest with you, brothers, like I haven't seen that. I haven't seen it in the public system. I've seen these like examples of people who kind of like extract themselves from the public system and then do these like, subaltern, underground, very small, indigenous and like self-autonomous approaches to educating our children. So I know it's possible at that level. But like, damn, like I pay taxes, like I'm pouring into this system. And so by definition, like, as a parent, that's my school, right? Like, why don't I get to decide if I paid for this? Don't tell me it's free. Public school ain't free. Fuck that. Like, I'm paying taxes. Taxes without representation is that's tyranny according to our own fucking constitution. So like, let me just use their language. Okay. So like, you said it. I didn't say that shit. You said it. How am I represented? How am I represented in this school, the public school that I paid for? I'm not. So I'm grabbing that. I'm claiming that's my school. Those are my children. You don't get to tell me in a pluralistic multiracial democracy where my voice supposedly counts, you don't get to tell me what counts for rigor in my child's education. You don't get to tell me what counts for adequate yearly progress for my sons. Nah, that's tyranny. That's big. It's so crazy to me how they can talk out of both sides of their mouth. Like conservatives, Republicans, call them whatever you want, right? They talk about they don't want big government. Okay, cool. Then why is the government determining what counts as academic progress for my children? You can't have it both ways. You can't. If you don't want big government, then let us self-determine. Let us use the public dollars to have local. I'm not telling you what you got to do with your kids. Go ahead and teach your kids Chaucer and Shakespeare as like literary bastion of excellence. Go ahead. I'm not tripping. Like my kids can read Chaucer. My kids can read Shakespeare. I'm not against that. But I'm saying if they read Chaucer and Shakespeare through the lens of Eurocentric values, then and they're not Eurocentric, then they're not really reading Chaucer and Shakespeare. They're just doing the mechanics, right? I want them to read Chaucer and Shakespeare through the Opata lens. Okay, how do you understand Chaucer and Shakespeare? As an Opata, as somebody who lives on Ohlone land. Okay, that's a true literary analysis. And my degree is in literature. So, like, I'm not talking out of my ass here. I'm saying that, like, the lens through which you interpret literature is significant. And if you don't know your own lens, if you don't know who you are and where you come from, if you don't know your 7 generations principles, then you can't possibly truly read literature. And I would say that's true for white kids too. White kids in this country don't know who they are. This is why they show up to school and cock the AR-17 and start blasting on their own homies and their teachers. Because we've created a deculturized society where nobody really knows who the fuck they are. So they hop on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or whatever else they're looking at to identify their own value. Okay. And we're now at a place as a society where we're literally in a place of collapse. This shit it's falling apart, as every empire has before us. And we have a choice right now as an empire to make a decision about the ways in which we engage with our children, because that's the future. Trump can talk all he wants about employment and economy and interest rates and all that. That's not future. That's not future. How our children see themselves and their responsibility to each other and their communities and the broader society and this planet. That's the future. And it troubles me to no end that we're not having any serious conversation about what that means for public education in this particular crisis that we're in. And we're going to come out of this. Not in the same place that we were. The most disconnected children are now months deeper into the most significant disconnection they've ever experienced. There isn't any fucking school right now. They're disconnected from every element of the society. The economy is throwing them away. Housing is throwing them away. School is throwing them away. The medical facilities have thrown them away. How you think they're going to show back up to school? We're going to just reopen in September, like, let's check out your SBAC scores. Let's talk about your AP scores. Let's talk about your college career path. Give me a break. We're in trouble. And if we don't use this as a chance to really look in the mirror and do some ilakesh, really understand that the definition of us as a state and as a nation is how we respond to the most vulnerable and the most wounded right now. And it troubles me like so deeply that there's no course correction happening right now. There's none. There's no revisiting of our values. There's no, it's a puro survival mode. And what that means is that when you got a ship that's sinking and you have limited life preservers, the people with the most resources and the most access are getting the life preservers first. And that is the history of this nation. And the history of this nation is on display right now. That in our moment of crisis, we are not reevaluating. And the cost of that generationally has already been borne out. The situation we were in before we hit COVID-19, before we hit global pandemic, before we hit shelter in place, before we hit any of that, okay? The history of indigenous genocide and African genocide was already upon us. And now you look at the data, The three groups that are the most disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 are Raza, indigenous people, and African people. Well, why is that? Because they're the groups that are doing the most unprotected labor. So here we go again. And unless we have a serious conversation as a nation about this as a turning point for us, you can mark it April 8th, 1236. I said it, that this is the end. This is the end of this empire, because there's too many people too profoundly impacted by this to recover. No matter what the stimulus package is, if the stimulus package doesn't focus on the most vulnerable and the most wounded, we're done for. And I'm not just talking about people of color. I'm talking about the multi-generational entrenched white poverty that's in the Appalachians. There's too many people, and you can't keep giving exit strategies to big business. The federal stimulus package gave exit packages to every business that has over 500 employees. What kind of shit is that? Like, every business under 500 employees was required to give 14 days of paid sick leave to their employees, and everybody over 500 got an exemption. Dude, if that's not mind-numbing to you as an approach to fuck the global pandemic, the national pandemic, if that's not mind-numbing, if that's not the maintenance of hegemony and social apartheid, tell me what is. We're in trouble. We're in trouble. And schools are a social mirror. So if you look at what's happening in schools, right, you just stare into that mirror. Whatever you see coming back to you is what's coming for the broader society. And that's what worries me. Because it doesn't have to be this way. It really doesn't. This isn't rocket science. But we've got to change who we prioritize and how we prioritize them if we're going to use this as an opportunity to really get on track to be the kind of nation state that we could be.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So I know a big part of your work has been, the word hope. And so during these times that you just spelled out, and a lot of the severe, really serious concerns that you have, what are some of and we all have, I mean, we're living it up here in Humboldt, I think, just as much as, what you're living in East Oakland, right? In your work. So what makes you hopeful, and sort of what are the things that you're doing in your own life to try to push the ball forward in the sense of trying to make some transformational change. With one being just raising our consciousness level right now. I think that this is awesome, just raising our level of awareness. But what are one of the things that keeps you hopeful, and also just some of the things that you're doing in your life right now to try to push the ball forward in the positive direction?
I draw my hope from and always have from young people. And I have twin boys, Dayeti and Amaru, who are 7 years old. And I'm a single dad. They're home with me. And I asked them yesterday how they're doing. And they're like, I'm fine. And I said, are you worried? Is there anything that's like concerning you? And they said, yeah. And I said, what? And they said, you and mom and abuelita and tío. My older brother just had open heart surgery. And I said, what do you mean? They said, we're worried about you. And I said, why? And they said, because this is direct quote, because you're most vulnerable to COVID-19. And they're 7. That makes me hopeful. Where does that go? Where does that go? They're in the community school that we founded. So they understand that the difference between Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? A closed pyramid, right? And the indigenous framework of wellness, which is a teepee, right? With the open top into the cosmos, understanding that right? It's not about us. It's not about our individual, right, wellness. It's about how we use our individual wellness to make others in our community and others generationally well. And my sons reflected in that comment an understanding of that you can't test. How the fuck do you test that? Show me the exam question that reflects my son's understanding about their responsibility to their papi, to their mami, to their abuelita, to their tío. Show me. Show me. You're testing the wrong shit. Who cares if my sons can do calculus and geometry? My sons are in first grade, y'all, and they just did like this diagnostic that says that they need to be doing geometry. They're in first grade. Okay, so let me just clarify. They don't need to be doing geometry. They don't understand fucking algebra. They can't even do their times tables. Okay, so they don't need to be doing, but the diagnostic said that they should be doing geometry. And that's my issue, is that we're diagnosing things wrong because we value the wrong things. One of my colleagues says, you measure what you treasure. And I treasure my sons' sense of their own identity and their sense of responsibility to their community and to their ancestors, both those who have come before us and those who are not here yet. That's what I treasure. And so that conversation with them, and generally my conversation with young people, makes me imminently hopeful. Like you talk to young people, nary a one of them can tell you their fucking test scores, because it's not central to them, right? You talk to young people, like there's dreams, there's hopes, there's visions, there's joy, there's play, there's all the things that we should be valuing. And then there's the adult spectrum about what we value as we relate to these young people, right? And that's what troubles me. It's not the young people. The young people are they're my medicine. And it's not just my sons. Like, I'm around young people, they're my medicine. Even in their worst moments where they make me want to choke them out and question having ever given birth to them, they're my medicine. And that's the sign of a well society. The well society points its focus, points its interest, points its investments at its youth and at its elders. Because the youth are literally the future. Not in some like Pollyannish Hollywood, right? Bullshit. Like they are literally the future. And the elders are the wisdom. And those are the two groups that we are the most disinvested in, not just in this society, but in schools. Think about any school you walk into. Who's the focus? It's adults, and it's middle-aged adults. I've been talking a lot to folks about the fact that, these schools that are struggling are like, hey, can you help us? And one of the things that I lift up for them is like, how many elders do you have in your school? How many elders are consistently present in your school? And I'm in schools all over the world, and there's the lack of presence of elders. And one of my tíos, Maestro Jared Teo, talks about the difference between an older and an elder, right? And just because you're older doesn't make you an elder, right? The concept of elderness is connected to wisdom. You've used your age and your years to gain wisdom that you can transfer, okay? So older doesn't mean elder. The absence of elders in schools is so striking to me, because you've got schools day to day, every single day, making major decisions about the future of our society, about the future of our communities, about the future of our children with no wisdom. So they're making these decisions like this, right? Because schools operate, right, under crisis all the time. So they make these critically important decisions at high speed without wisdom, which means they make institutional decisions. They make decisions that are best, safest, most useful for the institution, not for the community, not for our society. And when I step back and I think about what gives me, my mother's 91. She just learned how to do Zoom. The fuck? Like my 90-year-old mom just learned how to do Zoom. Zooms with my sons, played Uno with them. Okay? That makes me hopeful. My sons make me hopeful. What I'm trying to figure out is, how do we bring the groups sandwich in between them? The wisdom of the elders, right? The joy, the belief, the hope of the children. How do we bring that group, self-included? Okay, because I don't excuse myself from any of this. How do we bring us, okay, to a point where those, okay, are our information points? Those are our thought partners, right? That's what keeps me going, is that I have access to my elders and I have access to children on a regular basis. And because I have them, okay, I can make sense of and stay committed to what sits in between them and remain hopeful in a moment where hope is so profoundly under attack.
Thank you. Charlie, we have some questions from the audience. Did you get those?
Yeah, I got one right here. It's a really good one. I think it was one of the first comments, even from Amy Joy. Dr. Duncan-Andrade, What is your view on emerging focus on trauma-informed educational systems, specifically those that are using an individualized approach to trauma through ACEs scores?
Yeah, my tío, reference my tío Maestro Jerry Theo again, who I encourage you all to check out his work. He's one of the founders of the National Compadres Network. He's a medicine man. And I was on a call with him yesterday, actually, and he was talking about duality. And there's a duality there that on the one hand, like, I'm really glad that schools are acknowledging trauma, that it's real, and that it affects the biochemistry of children. It affects the biochemistry of anybody who's experienced trauma, but like, it's real. And there's no bad children. That if children are showing up and they're nutting up in your class or the school, it's because they're carrying toxic stress and trauma. And so you can create all these kind of behavioral interventions and, you know, consequences, and have all these, you know, dumbass like cards, red, yellow, green, like it if you don't address the trauma, you're just playing games. So that's great. Like, I didn't grow up in schools that acknowledge my trauma at all. And I didn't early in my career when I was teaching, you know, the schools weren't talking about trauma. Okay. So on the one hand, like, one part of duality is that I'm really glad that there's actually a conversation about trauma and about toxic stress and about early childhood experiences, that it's not about what happened to you yesterday. If you were 3 and you grew up in a household where you watched all kinds of violence or you experienced intense neglect, that's going to affect you at age 9 and 10 and 12 and 18 and 28 and 38 and 68. And there's no debate in the medical science about whether or not that's true. One of my favorite scholars is this woman. Her name is Tiffany Johnson. And she goes by Tiffany Marie sometimes, and she's an incredible scholar and an incredible artist. And one of the things that she said to me was that, like, it's a trip to me. She's an African woman. She said, a trip to me that, like, now that Western medical science is acknowledging all the things that my grandmother and our ancestors have been saying for years, suddenly it's true. So the fact that Western medical science is acknowledging trauma doesn't mean that it's now suddenly true. Like, our communities have been talking about this time memoriam. Like, your grandma, when she engaged, she knew how you were. You know what I'm saying? Like, she could do a diet. She didn't need a fucking ACEs score, right? She knew how you were doing, and she knew the medicine you needed, right? So I also want to say that, like, I don't want to, like, hyper privilege Western medicine, but some people need that, right? They're like, okay, like, oh, trauma's real, right? Oh, there's a survey, like you have a score, so ergo, like, your trauma's real. Okay, fine, fuck it. Like, if that's what you need, there's your score. Yes, okay, it's official. Okay, that's dope. However, I think what's embedded in the question is a questioning about how we're then approaching the score, how we're then approaching the child, right? And I think the question gets at one of my biggest concerns, which is it's hyper institutionalized, and it's this child, individual child, has trauma. We need to treat this individual child, right? And that's Maslow, right? It's not our way of knowing. Right? It's not the teepee. It's not the relationship to 7 generations of trauma. This kid's trauma is multi-generational. You've been fucking us up for hundreds of years. Don't act like this is the first time it's presented itself, right? This child is a forward going, a reflection of the ancestors. This is not a new concept. You can talk about 7 generations principles in indigenous communities. You can talk about the Sankofa prospect in African communities. Like, take your pick. We've been talking about this for time memoriam. And now you've got some Western science that validates it, and you're still looking to Western science for how to heal it. We've endured your traumas for centuries. Why aren't you looking to us? You know what I'm saying? Like, why are you asking these white doctors to come in and cure the trauma that white people and white doctors caused, as opposed to going to indigenous and people of colors medicine people to say, how have you fucking survived? How have you thrived despite all of the trauma we have answers to our own children's needs. And again, this is back to my earlier, we don't get to self-determine, because to look to us for answers would actually mean that you acknowledge that you're the problem. And people are loath to do that. So you create the problem that you then attempt to solve. And then you create more problems. Or as Brian Stevenson has said, that what you come up with is aspirin. Right? So then you start handing out aspirin for our headaches that you caused, and then the symptoms go away, but we don't stop getting headaches. So I think the question is spot on, that now that we're acknowledging that trauma is real and that toxic stress is real, and that it affects our children's abilities to show up as their authentic full selves, then the question is, what are the systems and practices that schools need to put in place to not just acknowledge it, but to heal it? And the work that we've been doing, so the organization you didn't mention it's called Community Responsive Education. That's our kind of national and global work around this whole conversation we've been having. And the work that we've been doing is really focused on saying nothing matters more in the schooling of children than their wellness. So clear the plate. I don't care about reading scores. I don't care about math scores. I don't care about any other of your measurables. Throw it all off the plate. I'm not saying they won't come back in. I'm saying wipe the plate. Make as much room as is needed for wellness. And in highly traumatized communities, that's going to be a major part of the work. Healing and wellness. Okay, then if there's some room on the plate, go ahead and add reading. Go ahead, because look, I'm the father of a 7-year-old boy named Amaru and a 7-year-old boy named Tayari, who are constantly asked on multiple occasions when they introduce themselves to re-say their name. My name is Jeff. Okay, when I say my name, don't nobody ask me to say it again. And my mother thought that by naming me Jeff, that I would be protected, right? What I've learned through ethnic studies is that no, what protects you is Tayari and Amaru. That's your armor, right? And they go, they insist, no. My name is Tayari. Not Thai, Tayari. Learn to say it. Amaru. Learn to say it. So they're 7, right? That's armor that they have on them. Okay. So, but that armor, Amaru Tayari, is connected to the tipi. They know what their name means, right? They know that the Tayari means essence of the ancestors from Huichol. Amaru is from Quechua, which means strength of the warrior. Right? These are 7-year-olds who know what their name means, right? That's the medicine that we need, right? To go back and say what's most important with our children is their foundation, their wellness, the understanding of their own sacredness. Mm-hmm. And until you foundationalize that, then reading and writing and math are just mechanical. You're creating robots. And they don't actually ever learn to read or write or do math. Because reading, writing, and math is freedom. This is how our people built pyramids, right? This is how our people wrote ballads. This is how our people created hieroglyphics. This is how our people created the let me just this is how our people created the Popol Vuh, right? This is how we created language. And you strip that away from us, and all we have left is our trauma. So none of this, the pyramids, the language, any of that was never about individuals, right? It was about our interconnectedness. And that's the value of ethnic studies. That's the value of wellness. The Western paradigm is sickness. And it's sickness as defined in a paradigm of individual wellness. You cannot be well by yourself. You can't. Human beings, by definition, are social beings, which means our wellness is connected to the people that are immediately in our social web. But the whole idea of trauma responsiveness is, let me deal with your trauma, as if your trauma is not connected to a larger web. Right? Now, there are examples. I don't want folks to stay in this kind of like, postmodern theoretical world. Look at the work of Maestro Jerry Theo on the National Compadres Network. Right? Look at the work of the Ethnic Studies Project in Arizona. Right? Look at the work of the Ethnic Studies Project in San Francisco. There's examples of curriculum and pedagogy and practices and approaches that are actually connected to real healing, not just a program. Programs don't work. People work. And if we're going to develop a meaningful response to trauma, if we're going to develop a meaningful response to wellness and healing, then we've got to invest in people.
Thank you. That was awesome. So I see that we're about at time. It's 1 o'clock. I just want to thank everybody for tuning in to this awesome dialogue. And I want to throw it over to my partner, Charlie, to say any last comments or thoughts.
Yeah. Once again, thank you so much for coming on with us. I think it was a really powerful experience. I mean, for me personally, I felt like I was listening very deeply, and I really resonated with how your sons are just kind of using and embracing their names as just one of the many forms of like an armor, and like I'm about to be a first time parent, and thinking about names and trying to be like aware, like, am I putting them up in a vulnerable position? But I'm like, no, hell with that. I'm going to embrace my lineage and who I am, just to make sure, like, no, you better say it right, because I've conformed, my people has conformed to your way of knowing and living since you guys got here. So it's not going to hurt you much to struggle a little bit, And so I think that's something that a lot of us indigenous people and underrepresented minorities could, embrace. Like, we're tired of being the victims. It's time to like take over, time to reclaim what we already known. And it starts with that local grassroots movement, like we already have the knowledge, we already have the tools. We just got to reclaim it, rediscover it, and, move forward. And it's not as easy as it is to say, but it's inspiring in that sense to just remember that, So I appreciate you coming on. We got a lot of feedback in the comments section. So if you have time, I highly recommend checking those comments out. We had pretty good engagement. So yeah, thank you again from us here up in Humboldt County.
Yeah, it's my honor.
Thank you very much.
Right. Take care.
Thank you, brothers. Be safe.
You too.